Scott Pendlebury from the Collingwood Football Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
This is Patrick Crouch from the Carlton Footy Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Max Gorn, Melbourne Football Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Number 33 in the 50 most relevant players for AFL Fantasy, Supercoach and Dream Team for 2025. We are talking about the Western Bulldog ruckman, Tim English. Top of his line the year before. One of the most expensive players the year before. And is he a lesson that set and forget is not the way to play the game anymore? Yeah, I'm going to have some fun on this episode. We are talking all things Tim English and the Rucks right throughout this episode of the 50 Most Relevant. Joining me on this podcast, a member of the Coaches Panel. He's also the co-host of our Keeper Ranks that we make available for our Patreons. So if you want to become a Patreon, all the details for that are in the podcast description. You can go and check that out. Full 8 series, 8 tiers. It is there ready for you, ready to go. I am talking about Kane. It's back on the pod. Hello, mate. How are you? Tim English. He's a very divisive name in the community, yet 12 months ago, he was hot property.
Oh, 100% MJ. And that's always what happens when you have the season you had in 2023 and then you regress down, especially when people jump on at the start of the season at a massive price tag, and he just didn't deliver simply, did he, MJ, based on what we thought he could be in this, particularly in those early rounds when with that investment, you're throwing the vice captaincy or captaincy on him pretty much every week. And yeah, it was just a dip. It wasn't a dip into insignificance. It was just a dip that left him, more in that 4th or 5th ruck position as opposed to clear-cut number 1 player in the comp.
Yeah, like you look through all of his elements, like a seasonal average of 104 points in fantasy and Dream Team. Like, it's just not bad, but it's just not top of the area, both in his line and top of his career of what he can do. But he's still setting you back $1 million plus in AFL Fantasy and Dream Team. An average of 108 in Supercoach. It's not bad, but it's just 15 to 20 points per game on average away from what the top-end guys were doing for us, especially when you're paying for an almost 130 average. But you can argue there's value and upside of 10 to 15 points per game in fantasy, 20 points per game in Supercoach in that format. He is 100,000. Last year, a season high score in Supercoach of 139 against the Cats. It's a fair chunk off what he did back in 2020, though. He joined the 200 club with a 204 against the Bombers in Supercoach. While in fantasy, against the Dockers, early in the year, he did deliver us a 141. Again, you just got to go back to that career season of 2023. Against the Cats, everybody's favourite team to ruck against just about, where he gave us a 158. He's not your traditional ruckman, though, is he? We'll talk about other rucks, I'm sure, throughout the 50 most relevant. We've looked at a Tom de Koning, we've looked at a Matt Flynn. I'm telling you, there are more rucks to come through the 50 most relevant, without any question. But he's not your traditional, physically imposing, hit out to advantage ruckman, lumber his way from contest to contest. He's in the closer mould to what Brodie Grundy was at his peak, which was really clean below his knees, can win the hard ball when there's an opportunity to take an overhead mark, whether it be the chop out need out of defensive 50 or slide him forward. We need to add some stability to our forward line. He gets in and around, involved the contest, his uncontested possessions and contested errors. They're midfield territories at times in his career. And we will talk about the drop-offs and ruck and stat line in a moment. But from just a pure top-line perspective, this isn't an additional midfielder for the Bulldogs. And understandably so, when all the cards fall his way, this is one of the best fantasy players going around, let alone the best rucks.
Yeah, well, MJ's career years would say that, wouldn't they? There's not many players that have scaled the heights that he scaled in 2023. And you're right, the way he builds his score, especially when he's on, like it's his work rate away from the opposition ruck that's super, super impressive. And it felt like that thing in 2023 that really put him over the top, particularly in Supercoach, was the intercept marking and also going forward and taking a contested mark and kicking a goal. Like he's been a guy that basically for his last 4 years, he's anywhere between half a goal to nearly a goal a game on average. So that's really, really important. Those are massive points. We know particularly contested marking in that 4 to 50 and in that D50, like they're big point opportunities. And it just felt like he just wasn't at his very best last year. And, as a result, he's fallen back in the pack. But he's still a quality player. Like, we're talking about it like it's a horrible year in 2024. And again, he's 4th for rucks in AFL Fantasy and he's 5th for rucks in Supercoach. So in a way, it's more of a credit to those guys that have jumped up, particularly, last year it was named Curvis and Cherry in Supercoach that really made those big strides. And we've known that Max Gawn's been a star forever, and Rowan Marshall in the last couple of years has scaled, really, really massive heights. So that it feels like as a whole, and we've discussed this before too, the ruck position, it's not just 1 or 2 anymore. There's a genuine class of 5, 6 or 7 that can jump to those heights. And I think that's the really interesting conversation this year in 2025 is who are the top 2? What is the difference between 1 and 2 and 3? And is there a group of guys that maybe we want to have a wait and see how it all pans out as we get actual football?
So, Kane, if we would look at that AFL Fantasy and Dream Team season, that 104.6 average, it's a 14 points per game dip from that year that you've alluded to in 2023. And yet still we're talking 11 tons last year, 5 of them over 120, including a 146. So, yes, it's not 2023, the career year, but it's not a disastrous season in isolation. It becomes the quote-unquote disastrous season when you base it off the price point you pay and what others were delivering at that time. But still, some ceiling in there, including a 146. And importantly, the basement's still pretty decent too. Only twice last year did he drop that scoring floor under 80. Still top 25 in the league for points, important given he didn't play every game. Still top 5 and one of only 5 rucks last year to average 100 plus in fantasy. So all is not lost for Tim English. It's not like he's regressed into oblivience and irrelevance. It's just not what you paid for at the start of the year. While in Supercoach, an average of 108, 14 tons, it is a pretty big drop of 20 points per game, but still the conversion of hundreds to 120s is relatively favourable. 8 of those scores were 120 plus, 6 of them were 130 plus. And again, just the 2 basement scores under 80 that weren't really great. But again, still sitting as a top 5 ruck by average, top 31 for total points and didn't play every game. So still a fantasy scorer. It's not the 128 Supercoach. It's not the 118 fantasy of 23. But it's still pretty darn good across all lines. But if I look at this area of how a player scores, it's hard to have the type of year that he did, but literally every element of Tim English's game fell away. Kicks dropped from 11.2 down to an 8.9. Handballs dropped from a 7.9 to a 7.6. His disposal efficiency held. His marks went from 6.3 down to a 6. His tackles went from a 4.3 down to a 3.8. His hitouts went from a 31.2 down to a 27. We can go more granular into his impact on the goals from 0.7 to 0.6. His binds actually increased. His free kicks for went down. His free kicks against went marginally. Like every little thing, bar 1 or 2 things, even his hitouts to advantage, like all these little things just went against him. And to get a near 130 average in Supercoach, to get a near 120 average in AFL Fantasy, let alone the need, if you're paying for it, to back it up, you need all those things to hold, 1 to pop and 1 to slow, not of the 10 scoring outputs, 8 or 9 to regress significantly. And unfortunately, that's what the year held for Tim English.
Well, MJ, that's why it's a career year, right? That's why 23 was so good. And I think that's why when you look at 2025, that's the appeal. You don't have to go too far back to remember what this guy can be. So that's where you start looking at 2024 and going, okay, if he's 104 in AF, where can he get to? Even if you don't think he can get back to those, career year heights in 2023, does he get back to 110? And if he does, and the top comes down in terms of a Marshall and a Cherry and a Gawn, he might have a little bit of upside and go back to being the number 1 ruck just with the standard dropping a little bit, because we know how good those guys back end of the seasons were, in particular Marshall and Cherry. Gawn's was a bit in reverse, where his start of the season was brute and then he sort of tapered off. So, that's what the rucks can be. You can have these monster runs where you just get the right matchup or you get the right conditions. So for me, it's not crazy to think that a Marshall and a Cherry and Gawn, have their own little bit of regression. And if English just goes a little bit up, all of a sudden you might nab the overall number 1 ruck at what you'd consider value with 3 to 5 points of upside at that price point, giving you a captaincy option. And I think that's the appeal, is when you're considering English, invariably, like all these positions, you really have to consider everyone else, because we know in the other lines, you've got 6 or 8 options, right? So you've got a bit of margin for error, and that's where the rucks are a bit different. And that's where last year it was really painful for people that didn't have Sherry. If you had, for example, a Gorn and an English, you're going, damn, I don't have Marshall or Sherry. You know, whatever combination you had, you're always looking for like that top tier. Whereas in the mids, we know as long as you've got the few that are really separating, really M5 onwards, you can mix and match with 5, 6, even upwards of 10 guys, depending on how long in the season is to go. So that's where I find it really fascinating, is you're weighing up probably 10 to 12 rucks all the way from the top to these value considerations. And then you've got to couple that with the makeup of the other 3 lines. And that's why rucks is always tricky. And that is probably the appeal of going set and forget in the past, is just going, I'm comfortable with these 2. I'm just going to leave that line and I'll worry about the others.
Because what you do with your rucks in your starting squad structure, it changes everything how you start with the rucks. If you go set and forget, well, not only are these your 2 captaincy choices, but now also it changes how high and how deep and how wide you can go in other positions. Conversely, if you go for a little bit more of a value approach with some names through there, we've already looked at a couple of these through the 50, like De Koning, Flynn, and Darcy inside the first sort of 15 players. Well, now all of a sudden, other options at the top end sit for you. Other options at the top become available to you. And so what you do in the ruck dynamically changes everything. I suppose before we get a bit more granularly into the rucks in general, because I do want to have a bit more of a chat about that, what do you think was the causation of the scoring dip across all these different arenas for Tim? Because I don't think it can be coincidental on just one thing. Like for Tim to fall away in hit-outs, in tackles, in goals, in kicks, it was everything. So I've heard in some portions of the community, and understandably so, the talk about the change to the ruck rule impacting how rucks impacted with the extension of the arm. I think that's a factor for Tim, especially who's not a hit-out ruckman, so to speak, where that's where he scores all of his points. He's mobile around the ground. Agility is real the points that helps him. I think that's a factor for why his hit-outs dropped, for sure. But that's probably not a factor for why the kicks drop, the marks drop, the handballs drop, the shots on goal drop. So is it just one specific thing? Is a lot of little threads not going his way? What to you was the reason we saw moment upon moment of scoring dip for Tim?
And I just think it's purely, that's what career years are. In career years, stuff just breaks right. You just get those extra little points. You're leading at the right time and you get that link-up mark. We see it with all great players that scale these heights, even Marcus Bontempelli in 2023 to now. Sometimes you just have that year where you feel like you can do no wrong. You go for a mark, it sticks. Even your bad kicks, they hit the target. Like, it just feels like it was one of those years where we're going to look back on his career and go, Tim English in 2023, he was just on. And he's just fallen back a little bit across the board. Even in 2022, he had a really good year. But I just don't think we're going to see what we saw in 2023. And that's where, for me, who knows exactly what it was. But I think the more curious thing is, if you consider last year to be a bad year, and as you flagged, it's bad when you paid top dollar and you're expecting 120s and 130s across the formats. But it's all about the projection. And that's the funny thing about all of these strategies, whether it's set and forget or value or a combination of the two. At the end of the day, set and forget is great if you pick the best 2 rucks.
Correct.
And that's what this whole game is. I think sometimes we want to make it about structures and strategies. At the end of the day, if you pick the right players, any of these strategies work. If you find the best 2 value rucks and you pick it and you nail it, you're flying. If you find the best 2 rucks of the year, particularly if they separate, like we've seen in years past with a Gorn and a Grundy, you're a genius.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, it's about picking players. And the hardest thing in this game is we've got a set pool of money to do it, and we can't have everything, right? And that's why it's so fascinating. You make one change, invariably you probably change another 6 things. So that's where, for me, you've got to put your projection cap on. You've got to say, where is English going to get to? Where are these other guys going to get to? Because, again, it's all well and good to go 105 ruck. In years past, we'd be ecstatic with 105 ruck.
Yeah.
The problem was last year we had two guys going upwards of 115.
In fantasy.
And in years past, we've had rucks go 120.
Yeah.
Look at the midfield last year, MJ. To say that Adam Treloar is just over 110 and he's the number one mid, you'd feel like 110 is a great number. We always say that's the Uber territory. But in years past, we've had guys go 115, 120, upwards of 125, 130. So that's where this game is so fun, is that, yes, we can take lessons and learnings from previous years. But at the end of the day, it's for 2025. You've got to put it into practice for this year. And invariably, the picks that win you the comp are when you get those projections right, you make those calls, get them right. You see a trend before it happens and you jump on. Like, that is the game. Yes, we've got data and things that we can use, but the one I feel like that always bobs up its head is if you think a guy's a 100 guy and he's averaged 90 at the halfway point of the season, he's probably going to find a way to get there, and he's probably a guy that you want to jump on because you know the good scores are coming, particularly these guys that we've seen 5, 6, 7 and beyond seasons where you know who they are. Unless there's an injury there or another circumstance that's changed their role significantly.
Yep.
That's sort of how it turns out to be as an MJ. What goes up must come down, and often the guys that start slow, they revert back as well. So as much as we love all the strategies, at the end of the day, you have to put your money where your mouth is and make a projection. If you've got English as a 110 guy and you've got those other guys coming back to the pack, by all means pick him.
Yep.
But the hard part, particularly with the rucks, with only two of them, you have to be right. If you can be right with set and forget, happy days, you're laughing. If you're not so sure, I think that's where people go value, because it buys them a bit of time to take stock of the landscape, see where they want to go, see who's emerged, see who the cherry of 2025 is, see who the English of 2023 is. Like, that's the advantage of that strategy. But at the end of the day, you're going to have to put a team together. You're going to have to make 30 or 31 calls depending on the format.
Yep.
And that's the skill, and that's the hard thing, and that's invariably why people keep coming back, right, MJ, is that
100%.
Every year is a new year.
Yeah. Oh, look, thank goodness for super coaches and dream teamers. You've got the flex. And so some of that positional scarcity for rucks, certainly how we've seen the game change, more super coach with the favourable hit out to advantage. Rule than what is evident for dream team. Just that third option ruck could just be helpful enough. The third best ruck in the league from a scoring perspective could be better than the seventh best defender, the ninth best mid. This is the beauty of the flex
and
for us.
Particularly in Supercoach, it has been in the past, hasn't it? Like, that's been something that we dreamed of in the past.
Yep.
We couldn't often fit in a Sean Darcy in that career year if you already had a Max Gawn and someone else. So
Correct.
It has been a position in recent times that is starting to be, when you look at the top 20 players, it feels like there's more rucks in there than ever. And the numbers probably do reflect that. So I think in those two formats in particular, that's another element of strategy that we obviously are yet to experience. But it probably does make a Tim English that little bit more relevant in those two formats as opposed to AF that doesn't have that flex position.
Do you think there's regression in a Max Gawn, or do you think he can maintain career year in fantasy, which he had last year, and not too far off it in Supercoach? Do you think that the Tristan Cherry breakout that happened last year, can that maintain, let alone increase, or do we see a little bit of regression? Rowan Marshall's been pretty consistent for back-to-back years, but do you think that's going to maintain, or do you think there's a little bit of regression? Because what you think about those three rucks, let alone then with, does De Koning get the sole ruck shot or not? Does Darcy stay fit? Is Flynn winning the ruck one battle? These players and what you think is happening around them make Tim English a relevancy conversation of it for you or not, of whether it's, I think he's going to be close enough. He's unique. I like some of that starting matchup. I'll jump in. No, I don't want to pay up near that 600K market in Supercoach at all, or $1 million plus in Fantasy and Dream Team. So I'll look for value. Or no, if I'm going to spend that much, I'll go after the certain thing. But is 2024 a tale of warning around set and forget? Or more, as Kane has alluded to, how important it is that when you get that prediction right, how strong it sets you through? one last thing I want to talk about, Kane, before we look at what this means about where you draft him on the keeper platform, which is where the coaches panel chooses to draft in 2025, is just around this buy that he's got. Because if you look at him as a starting option or a early quarter or a third of the year, it's a little awkward based on who else is on the buy. But if you look at him as an upgrade option, especially off of a Flynn or a Darcy type, it's a beautiful spot. But it's awkward because depending on how you look at it, the buy could be favourable or painful for you.
Oh, 100% MJ. Like typically that first mid-season buy, which is the one that Tim English has in round 12, it's normally something that we target as an upgrade, don't we? Just because we know that we can go to them early. They're going to be there through the remaining buys. And obviously English as well doesn't have one of those early season buys by playing opening round. So that's appealing in itself. I think the hard thing is some of the other teams that share that buy. So even starting in the ruck line with the Carlton, Tom De Koning at the moment feels like one of those guys that we feel like has baked in value, just what he did last year without Pitnet at the side. We know Sherry's super popular and rightfully so, by the way, he in particular finished last year. And then you get to Port Adelaide, who maybe not the ruck, it's as much of a consideration, but Butters, Rosie, Horn-Francis in the forward line. You know, there has been a lot of discussion about could there be a breakout defender with the departure of Houston. And then going back to the Bulldogs, Bont, Treloar, Libba, Carlton,
Dale,
Fritz, Newman, Walsh, whoever else you want to go with. It is a buy around that. How many of these guys do you already have going into it? Is obviously a balancing act. And then clearly after the fact, you can do whatever you like, right? As long as you think they're someone you want for the rest of the year, or they fill a role for you across a stretch of time or the right price, go your hardest. But typically that's a buy around where, yeah, we like to have a wait and see and have a look and just manage that. We don't want to have too many of those guys heading into that first buy round. And that's probably where I sit with English MJ as a whole. Is he's a nice watch and see. It's not as much value as you'd probably like. If he was 5 or 10 less, if he had that much of a dip, you'd probably feel a bit better. Or if there was an injury game or some of those just triggers that we look for that give us that little bit of confidence in value. But as we said, his bad year last year was more just the fact that he couldn't recapture the career form that he showed in 2023, and he did have a fall away. So, the ruck line's typically one I do like to find a way to have a look and see. And if it's backing in one big dog and a value, that's typically where I like to go. Because even if it's just not knowing who the top few are, how many times MJ does a value ruck present? Jordan Sweet last year. We've seen Riley O'Brien in the past be that guy. We've just seen people just pop up out of nowhere and go, I need this person on the field. They are outperforming so much. I just don't want them on the bench. I need to find a way to get them on the field. Even Lloyd Meek last year, MJ, was another guy that if you jumped on at the right time, you're off to the races, made massive cash. So when there's only 2 spots, as I said, you've really, really got to be confident they're going to be right up there if you go set and forget. But clearly as well, it's that balancing act to the whole team. There might just not be a value ruck that you have any confidence in. You might be forced to make that call. So fascinating as always, the rucks, MJ. It's amazing how much time we spend on 2 on-field positions.
Every single year we do it. There is a world where if just 2 or 3 variables of how Tim English scores can just bounce towards that career season, or if what our top echelon rucks delivered regresses back 5 to 8 points per game, if one or both of those elements land in 2025, Tim English is back at the top of the tree in our rucks and becomes a really fascinating starting squad option, let alone is he someone, should you choose the pathway of needing to trade into a ruck or add an extra flex spot, he becomes super interesting. So much about our ruck structure will impact the rest of our starting squad movements, let alone our upgrade cadence in 2025. But on the keeper platform, where he goes on draft day, to me feels picking his exact spot is going to be hard, but I think I'd say it's pretty unanimous he'd be the 4th ruck off the board. I don't see a world where on draft day people, again, even regardless of the format or scoring customization in their format or league to have where Cherry, Marshall, Gawn aren't the first three rucks gone on draft day. He's, to me, the kind of universal ADP fourth ruck. But it's so hard to know because some leagues, if they don't get their hands on that first three, who could all rightly so be first-round selections, by the way, does someone jump in that second round because they don't want to miss on a top tier, because I think he is one? Or do they just wait and get the Briggs, the Cameron, the Riley O'Briens at the middle third to latter third of their draft because they go, don't get the top three, I don't care who I get. So English's ADP, while we know he'll be the fourth ruck off the board, gosh, where he goes on draft day, the range of outcomes is huge.
Yeah, and that's where it really depends, MJ, how many have you got on field. If you've got the 7 midfield format that a lot of people play where it's 5 defenders, 7 mids, 1 ruck and 5 forwards, for me, I just don't see any real value going these rucks early, just because the drop between your M1 and N7 is often way more than the sort of 10, 15 points that it is from an English to the guys you mentioned there who are sort of the 10th and 12th rucks. So for me, I sort of just am happy to wait on rucks and see where it falls and really build that strong midfield line. But again, you might play in a side that's only 3 defenders, 4 mids, 1 ruck and 3 forwards, and there's a bit more premium on English there. So the format that you're playing really depends, and that's how it shakes out the structure. But yeah, English is the fourth ruck, in my opinion, in AFL fantasy. Probably hard to see him moving from that point, just with how good those first 3 have been. But yeah, I just feel like it's a ruck year, MJ, where you can just wait and be patient and build out everything else. And, you know, if there's only 10 teams in your league, once you start seeing, you know, Riley O'Brien, Meat, DeConing will probably get pushed up as well. Like, you're getting a pretty good ruck. They're not going to take 2 rucks unless you've got the flex option till very, very late. It's just not worth it. And even in an absolute worst, you're getting stuck with like an Oscar McInerney, which is totally fine, in my opinion, if that's a late pick. So the strategy of that is totally different, but I think you're right. The main point there is probably the fourth ruck off the board.
Yeah, mate, love talking about not just rucks, but fantasy footy with you. I know we'll have you back on the 50 most relevant, let alone throughout the coaches panel preseason and the season proper. As always, mate, a pleasure to talk fantasy footy with you, bud.
Thanks, MJ.
Hey, if you want to go check out the rest of this series, you can. Wherever you're tuning into this episode, the 50 most relevant is there. If you're watching this on YouTube, for example, hi, subscribe, comment below. Let me know what you think. Max Gawn, Tristan Cherry, Rowan Marshall, all these guys are going to average alongside your predictions for what you think Tim English is going to do for us in 2025. If you're listening to this as an audio podcast, wherever that is, give us a 5-star rating, subscribe. Make sure the notifications are on, so as soon as a new episode drops, you know it's there. You can get the headphones in and listen to the latest episode of the 50 Most Relevant. Inside the description of this episode, all the details to join our Patreon, reach us and get in touch with us across social media, get your hands on some Coaches Panel merch. So, who's tomorrow in the 50 Most Relevant? I'm going to make it super easy for you. Not so much to guess who, but I want to change the conversation that we've had today and look at the other end. I want to stay in the ruck line, though. But I've preached a lot this year already about the upside of value in the rucks. The upside of value in the rucks. And we've already looked at a couple. Flynn, potentially undeniable. Darcy, potentially undeniable. English has already been a top liner a little bit over 12 months ago. But what I haven't done in 2025 is build the pathway and conversation for why looking at a top line ruck could be one of the most powerful and appetizing and compelling decisions you make in 2025. And it could be the thing that sets you apart from the rest. Yep, I ain't anti paying up for rucks. This guy that's tomorrow, I'll put it this way. If I was starting any expensive ruck, I'd probably start him. Who is he? You'll find out tomorrow in the 50 Most Relevant.